Okay. Yeah, I spent 50 years forecasting, and they finally said, well, you haven't been right. In 50 years, it's time you retire and let some of the young folks take care of that. In 2008, Hurricane Ike devastated southeast Texas, causing $30 billion worth of damage. Now, what's happened over the last 7 years, and I'm going to show you some of those pictures here in a minute, but I also would like to emphasize to you that as I talk, I could also answer the question, what would happen to the west end of Galveston Island if we had a repeat of the 1900 storm? I'm going to answer that here in a minute. And I'd also like to point out to you that the Bolivar Peninsula, the untold story. Now, Hurricane Ike was an African disturbance. It became a Category 4 storm as it approached the islands. Then it weakened over Cuba. And finally, on Thursday, September the 11th, it was in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, I don't know what happened there. Let's go one more. There we go. It was in the Gulf of Mexico and strengthening. Thursday was a very critical day for the folks over on the Bolivar Peninsula, and I'll show you the Bolivar Peninsula here in just a minute. Because on Thursday, they were told if they were going to evacuate, they had to do it on that day. You see, there's only two ways to get onto the Bolivar Peninsula. You could go by ferry on the west end, or you could go over a very low road on the east end. And so they were told that the road would be flooded by Friday morning and that the ferries were going to stop running Thursday night. So they anxiously waited on Thursday to find out what the status of Hurricane Ike was. And when it was designated as a Category 2 storm, many of the folks out there made a very calculated decision to stay there. You see, they had been involved in the evacuation on Rita in 2005, and it was a disaster. Those of you are aware of that. And they said no longer. In the future, yes, if it's a major hurricane, a 3, 4, or 5, we're going to get out. But we're not going to get out if it's a tropical storm or even a Category 1. And yeah, we may even stay if it's a Category 2. So somewhere between 100 and 150 people stayed on the island as that storm approached. Now, the eye of the storm passed right over the entrance to Galveston Bay. The Bolivar Peninsula is that little area to the sea to the east there. It's about 20 miles long, 1 to 2 miles wide, and then you have Galveston on the left side. And so the unfortunate thing about this storm is that in terms of wind, it was a Category 2 hurricane. But in terms of storm surge, it was a Category 4 as far as the Bolivar Peninsula is concerned. So the storm surge there were 15, 17, maybe 18 feet high. Notice on the left-hand side of the eye, the storm surge on the west end of Galveston Island was only 8 to 10 feet, generally less than 10 feet. Now, as we take a look at, there we go. What I'm going to show you, I want to go back here. I'm having trouble. All right. Let me go forward. Well, what happened is the water spilled in behind over the Bolivar Peninsula, spilled in behind the Galveston, the city of Galveston, and flooded the city, and there was all kinds of people had problems there. The water in the street rose some 8 feet, and all kinds of people had to go into housing there in Galveston. As a matter of fact, a lot of those houses were not destroyed, but they were severely damaged, and altogether there was about 2,500 homes that were provided by HUD. HUD said if your home was over 50% damaged and you can prove that you do not have the resources, then we will rebuild you a home. And in that home, if you stay in it 3 years and pay the taxes and also pay the insurance, then it will be your home. But the real damage took place out on the beach side of the island. I'm going to show you some pictures from Jamaica Beach, Pirates Beach, Bermuda Beach. Bermuda Beach is just beyond the west end of the seawall in Galveston. Jamaica Beach and Bermuda Beach were older developments. Pirates Beach was one of the more modern developments, and it was very upscale. This is Jamaica Beach, 4 houses before the storm, and all 4 of those houses were destroyed. Notice there's 2 houses inland on the left-hand side there, and there's 2 vacant lots. Well, it's interesting that FEMA came along and said if you have a house in the first 2 rows and it's over 50% destroyed, you're eligible for a buyout at pre-hurricane prices. Well, needless to say, the four houses that were destroyed decided to take the buyout. Also, the two houses on the left accepted the buyout. Now, this means that the two vacant lots are now beachfront property. And they couldn't wait to get down there and build their house because they're now on the beach. Now let's go to, let's go to Pirates Beach. You know, this is skipping some pictures here. I don't understand why that's doing that. But there are three houses here. Those houses, incidentally, had survived Alicia in 1983. Notice now the house with the orange roof. Well, it's the only house that survived. The three houses ahead of it were washed away. And the folks in that orange roofed house were delighted because they felt like, now we have beachfront property. And what a view we have of the beach. Well, it turns out that the FEMA buyout is only for the first two houses. The third house was not in the FEMA buyout. And so the owner of that has, wow, we now have beachfront property. So they built this big, huge house there, kind of blocked the view of the folks there in the orange roof. Here's a house that survived Alicia, and I mentioned Alicia because Alicia was the last major storm in southeast Texas, and that would have been in 1983. This house survived it, and there was another house built on the vacant lot right behind it. And there you can see the two houses. Look at the geotube. You know, some of you folks have been found that the geotubes were advertised to protect you during a hurricane. Well, that didn't work out very well. First house is totally gone. And both of those houses accepted the FEMA buyout. The two houses here survived Alicia in 1983. This is what they looked like before Ike. Now, if you look carefully, you'll see that the floor level of the house right on the beach is a little higher than the house in the inland area. Well, normally we expect the most damage to be to the beachfront house. Well, it was the second house that was washed away. Again, both of them accepted the FEMA buyout. This house didn't look bad from the air, but apparently it had a lot of damage because they also accepted the FEMA buyout. Now, this house survived Alicia in 1983. We're moving on east now. We're in Bermuda Beach. Well-built house. Look at the pilings all the way to the roof line. This house was integrated together. It survived Alicia, and the owner there said, oh, man, I have a hurricane-proof house. Well, that's his house with the black roof. Both he and his neighbor are gone. Now, I've put a yellow box around some of the homes that survived just to help you orientate yourself. So we had the two homes on the beach and the one to the right, all except the FEMA buyout. Now, the folks after World War II in Texas were very concerned about their beach. They wanted that beach to be accessible to all residents of Texas. So they passed what is called an Open Beach Act in 1959, which says the state owns all the property ahead of the vegetation line. And if that vegetation line moves back inland beyond your house is now on state property, and they have a legal right to come in and to take that and to force you to remove that house. Well, in 2004, the state designated about 100 homes that were in violation of the Open Beach Act and told the homeowners that they were going to have to remove their house. Well, that created quite a stir. So the state backed off and put a moratorium on that, said, well, let's wait 2 years and see if that vegetation does return. We went down to the beach and drove along that line in 2005. Every beachfront home was for sale. It was amazing. Well, a lawyer from California came in and bought 3 of those houses. This is one of the houses she bought. She bought it in the early part of 2005. Hurricane Rita came along in 2005, moved the vegetation line back ahead of her house. The state went to her and says, now you got to remove your house. Well, she sued. She sued the state. So the requirement that you remove your house was delayed until the lawsuit was settled. And finally, in 2011, after bouncing around in the legal system for several years, the state Supreme Court in Texas ruled that the Open Beach Act was no more valid. The state only owned the property up to the high water mark, which meant that she didn't have to remove her house. Well, that's okay. Ike came along and settled the whole issue. Did damage to the house. Now, remember now that the payout for FEMA is at the pre-hurricane price. She got $315,000 for this particular house. Brian Carlisle has a picture down the beach. That's her house that survived there. If you look carefully on the right-hand side, you see that whole row of pilings. Every beachfront home in Bermuda Beach was washed away. This was her home, and she accepted the buyout as well as her neighbors. They've had an erosion problem in Texas down through the decades. This was after Alicia in 1983, and it really highlighted the Open Beach Act, and the state came down and threatened these folks and said, you're going to have to remove your house. Well, it's amazing how quickly the vegetation returned there. I was down there a couple weeks after Alicia, and I saw all these trucks going to the beach. What are these trucks doing? And they were out there dumping dirt. And they also had the sod that came in afterwards. And every few years, they had to repeat the process. I took this picture in 1989. There they are, pushing dirt back underneath those same three houses. And if you look carefully, you can see the sod over there to the left. And before Francis, a tropical storm in 1998, there was a vegetation line ahead of those three houses. But Tropical Storm Francis had a lot of erosion. It took out the house on the left, took out the house on the right, and the one in the middle survived, and now the Open Beach Act is not valid, so they didn't have to remove their property. Well, I settled the issue, took that property right out. So here again, we have 6 houses that responded to FEMA in the buyout. Here are 8 houses before the storm. Spanish Grand is right on the east end of Bermuda Beach. Only 2 of those survived, but they all accepted the buyout. Now, one of the provisions in FEMA, if you accept the buyout, you had to remove the house. Notice the house over on the right-hand side. As we look at the after picture, you can see that house on the left is gone. Well, the house on the right, they decided to accept the buyout. You have 90 days to remove your house. Now, you can remove it to higher ground, but there's no higher ground on Galveston. So the alternative is to bulldoze it. And they were in the process of bulldozing that house at the time. So here again, we have 6 more houses that were bought out by FEMA. Altogether, FEMA bought out 68 houses on the Galveston Island. There were 98 houses totally destroyed. In Bermuda Beach, 43. Every beachfront home was washed away. Now, that's a disaster. But nothing compared to what happened over on the Bolivar Peninsula. Now, as we head over towards the Bolivar Peninsula, we're going to pass over a historical nightclub that was there from the 30s. Well, it's gone, as well as the pier that went out to that nightclub. Now we're headed to the Bermuda Beach. Down here in the lower left-hand corner, that's where the entrance to Galveston Bay is. That's where the ferry is located. This island, Bermuda, is about, or the Bolivar Peninsula is about 20 miles long, 1 to 2 miles wide. Way over on the right-hand side, you see Gilcrest. That's where the Rollover Pass is located. Now, remember the number 98. Because in the Bolivar Peninsula, there were 5,000 homes before the storm. 3,500 were totally destroyed. This is what's going to happen to the west end of Galveston Island if we have a repeat of the 1900 storm. Notice the big house up there on the left-hand side with the black roof. There was a series of 10 homes, beachfront homes, before the storm. Now I'm going to shift the camera. We're going over on the left-hand side of the picture. See the house that's circled with yellow? That means it was going to be destroyed. We're going to look back to the northeast. There's the house, the big one that I just showed you. It'll be destroyed. And there's only one house with the yellow box that survived in this particular scene. Interesting, in the rebuild, it looks like the house that was destroyed down here probably used the same floor plan. It looks exactly like it did. This is the rebuild that I took this picture a couple of years ago. Now, this gives you a little broader picture. Up in the upper part of the picture, on the left-hand side, you see the black house, the big black house. And there's the 10 beachfront homes. The lower part of the picture shows you the number of homes that were destroyed in that picture alone. 45, 22 of them have been rebuilt. Kind of an interesting scenario here on the lower box, a little modest home sitting about 3 lots back from the beach. You'd think maybe that'd be the first one that would go. And notice I've also circled one there on the right. Well, the one on the left survived. Well, look at all the houses around them that were destroyed. In the house that I showed you there on the left, they bought the lot in front of them. And they thought, man, we've now got beachfront property. So they went in there and built this big, huge house right on the beach. And there you can see the little greenhouse. The reason it survived, an engineer told me, it was well integrated. It was all tied together, and so it did survive. Here's the big house that I just showed you. I talked to that couple, and they're just ecstatic. They've got this beachfront house. Well, not quite. Look right in front of them, and somebody come in there and put a big house right in front of them. So they refused to accept the FEMA buyout. Way up to the upper left-hand corner, see that house that survived? I counted 125 houses in this picture alone that were destroyed. 89 have been rebuilt. Carol's bed and breakfast, Carol had kind of an interesting experience. She and her friend were going to evacuate on Wednesday, and her friend says, you know, there's a lady living down the street that's elderly. She's disabled. Somebody's got to look after her. So they went down, and the lady said, well, yeah, I won't evacuate today, but let's wait till tomorrow. So they brought her back up to Carol's bed and breakfast, put her in bed there, got up the next morning, had coffee, got ready to leave, knocked on her door. She wouldn't come out. They knocked on her door all day. She wouldn't come out. She bolted herself inside of in that bedroom. So in the late afternoon on Thursday, Carol and her friends had a decision to make. Well, should they leave their house with a stranger in it who was disabled, or should they stay there and see what and help her survive the storm? They said, well, it's only a Category 2 hurricane. After all, you can see they're well inland from the beach itself. So they decided to stay. They were very fortunate that they survived. The deck level there at their house is 16 feet above mean sea level. Inside of the house, there was a still water mark at 8 inches. So that means the storm surge here had to be 16 or 17 feet. Carol said at the height of the storm, the waves would break over top of their house. She said it was quite an experience. Doesn't want to go through that one again. So there's the bed and breakfast. It has survived, and you can see there is some survival there. Another couple got in trouble. They saw the flooding started occurring. They said, well, we got to get to higher ground. So they waded in waist-deep water to get to this church that was on higher ground, opened the door to be greeted by a lion. Some of you shelter managers, that would be an interesting experience, wasn't it? There was a guy out there that had kind of a mini zoo, and he had this lion, and he managed to get into the church before anyone else got there. I don't know whether I'd want to stay in there with a lion. As bad as things were on the heart of the Bolivar Peninsula, that would be basically Crystal Beach, they weren't nearly as bad as they were at Gilchrist. Here's the rollover pass that I told you about. There were 500 homes here before the storm. Only 2 survived that were livable. I'm going to show you a picture that nobody has ever seen. I only ran into it a few months ago. This was a picture that was taken about noon, shortly after noon, on the Saturday that the eye made landfall. This would be about 12 hours after the peak of the storm surge. And you can see the island is completely covered by water. The water depth here, I would estimate, was probably 6 or 7 feet. At the height of the storm, it was up to the top of the pilings on the Adams home there. Now, the reason you've never seen this picture is because an airline pilot who had property down there at Rollover Pass was so concerned about what happened to it, he jumped in his private airplane with the winds gusting 60 miles an hour and flew down there and found his home was gone, and he took this picture, and he refused to release the picture because he violated the no-fly zone. David, you were mentioning about that, and he was afraid if he released the picture, somebody would get him in trouble. Well, what about the Adams home? This is what it looked like before the storm. There was a small church out ahead of him, and there were 2 homes on the beach side of his home. They had bought a home on this property prior to Rita in 2005, but Rita did a lot of damage to them. And they found out that the pilings all dry rotted. So they bulldozed the house down and built this home that we see here today. And that's the one that survived. The floor level was at 16 feet. They had about $40,000 worth of damage, but they did manage to survive. Well, what about the Adams? What's happening to them? Well, they bought the new beachfront lots, so they now have beachfront property. They bought 2 lots across the street and opened a bar and restaurant. They're doing all right. But what about the rest of Gilchrist? FEMA has bought out 383 of the 500 lots out there. We were down there recently, and I counted 62 homes that have been rebuilt or partially rebuilt, and only 8 of those have been on the beach side. Gilchrist will never be the same as it was before. And notice rollover pass, the state now is in the process of trying to close that pass. You see, a lot of sand drifts up through that pass and affects the inland waterway, and then they have to dredge the inland waterway. So they want to close it. And they've gone through the court system now, and I think they have the legal right to go ahead and close it. So it looks like to me that what's going to happen then is they're going to close it. So what's going to be the history of Gilchrist is they write the history books. Well, a beautiful little fishing community that was almost totally destroyed by a hurricane in 2008. So what are some of the lessons we learned in this storm? Well, one, go up. These 5 homes had been built way on the eastern part of Gilchrist. Notice they put the pilings at 18 feet, the floor level at 18 feet. They did survive. So if you go down to build on Galveston or the Bolivar Peninsula and along the waterfront, 17 feet is about the mandatory height now. And that house on the left is at 17 feet. Well, if you go higher than that, the insurance company will reduce your rates. I don't know how high the floor level is on that one to the right, but now we got a house that's built way up to where the wind can get to it. Well, what about the rest of southeast Texas? One of the things that has been proposed is called an Ike dike. They would put a 17-foot seawall in front of the Bolivar Peninsula and extend the seawall out on the west end of Galveston Island. Remember, the seawall is only about 10 miles wide, and it is right in front of the city itself, and they'd put hurricane gates there at the entrance to Galveston Bay and also at San Luis Pass. The only problem is it costs somewhere between $7 and $11 billion. Now, that seawall is not designed just to protect the beautiful homes there. The primary purpose of it will protect the industrial area at the north end of Galveston Bay. Over 50% of the gas that we used in this nation is processed at that industrial complex at the north end of the bay. If we had a major hurricane push water up into the north end of the bay, it would be an economic disaster, not just only for Texas, but it would be an economic disaster for this nation. Seems to me like $10 billion is kind of a cheap insurance policy to protect a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's estimated that somewhere between $50 and $100 billion would be the damage if we had a repeat of the 1900 storm. So maybe the Ike dike makes sense. We'd ought to be doing something. If you want to know more about this storm, you can read about it in Infinite Monster. This was written by 2 reporters that work for the Galveston Daily News. And here's Brian also has a book out called After Ike. He took a lot of aerial photographs, some really nice aerial photographs there. Appreciate the opportunity of sharing with you today.